Most humans operate under the quiet assumption that closure is a universal necessity. When conflicts end or connections fracture, there is a subtle compulsion to explain, to justify, to provide finality. Patterns emerge. Explanations are offered, apologies rehearsed, reassurances given. On the surface, these acts appear civil, even moral. Beneath the veneer, they function as instruments of control. Closure is rarely neutral. It is a mechanism through which one party can dominate perception, shape the narrative, and convert generosity into leverage, while the provider of closure unknowingly trades autonomy for peace. Every word spoken in the name of resolution becomes a thread in their web, mapping intentions, motives, and vulnerabilities. The more complete the explanation, the more powerful the illusion that they hold control over your story. What feels like an offering of peace is often a quiet surrender. A transaction disguised as civility. You feel the pull, a subtle pressure curling around your chest like frost. The demand for explanation is silent, yet omnipresent, lodged in the spaces between their words and glances. Every instinct whispers that reason and apology will pacify the tension, that truth must be offered to secure peace. You may try to speak, to lay your intentions bare, but with each syllable, they pry further, mapping your mind, cataloging your weaknesses. He who wishes to be obeyed must know how to command without being seen. Machiavelli said, and in that command lies the subtle art you are forced to navigate. In giving closure, you expose the corridors of your own strategy, letting them wander freely where they should never tread. The illusion of peace is the mirror. Your reflection is the leash they hold. Their curiosity, their need for understanding, is insatiable. You sense it in the pauses, in the questions left unasked, in the expectation that you will illuminate every dark corner of the past. Every story you recount, every justification offered, solidifies their power over your perception. Honesty becomes a chain, clarity a leash. Machiavelli's words echo again. The promise given was a necessity of the past. The word broken is a necessity of the present. By refusing to fill their gaps, by denying the final act they demand, you preserve the one thing they can never possess, your autonomy. Let the silence stretch. Let the ambiguity fester. Their unease is the reflection of your freedom. The less you explain, the more complete your dominion. And in that dominion, you discover a strange clarity. The world is never pacified by explanations, only manipulated by the absence of them. To offer closure is to place yourself in their hands. To withhold it is to place them in yours. Silence, measured and deliberate, becomes the first law of survival, the initial move in a game whose rules only you are permitted to write. Humans are wired to feel the emotions of others as if they were their own. In social bonds, compassion is praised, kindness rewarded, understanding exalted. Yet the very instinct that allows connection is also a vulnerability, a mechanism that can be exploited. When one leans toward empathy, the act appears noble, yet it exposes internal patterns to manipulation. Emotional openness becomes data, understanding becomes a portal, and care transforms into currency. Beneath the surface, empathy is rarely pure. It is a bridge over which others can seize influence. You feel their suffering as though it burns inside your chest. Each pause, each glance, each subtle sign of distress tugs at your instincts, pressing you to respond, to console, to explain. Every part of you wants to repair, to soothe the unease, to fill the void they present. Yet every gesture, every word you offer is catalogued and analyzed. Their need for closure, for resolution, is never a call for mutual understanding. It is an invitation to infiltrate the borders of your mind. You may think empathy is selfless. The truth is sharper. Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, Machiavelli said, and in observing your actions, they measure your weakness, your threshold for concession, your willingness to surrender pieces of yourself. What you consider generosity, they interpret as malleability. The act of reaching toward them is a trap disguised as intimacy. Your compassion becomes a mirror, reflecting your vulnerabilities back to them, while they shape a narrative in which your emotions are their advantage. The more you bend toward their discomfort, the more control they wield over the contours of your behavior, and the deeper the trap becomes. The pressure intensifies when you recognize how easily empathy can be weaponized. You notice yourself rationalizing, explaining, justifying, not for clarity, but to ease the tension within your own conscience. Every explanation is another doorway for them to step through, another map of your thresholds for compromise. Their gaze is not passive. It is calculating, waiting for the precise moment to exploit the smallest crack in your armor. The instinct to comfort is not a flaw of character. It is a flaw of power. In giving in, you provide leverage over your autonomy, transforming goodwill into a tether that binds you to expectations you did not choose. Machiavelli's insight resurfaces. It is much safer to be feared than loved, when, of the two, either must be dispensed with. In this context, empathy without boundaries is fear's opposite. It invites manipulation, erodes authority, and exposes the contours of your influence. You begin to see the subtle architecture of their strategy. Every sigh you absorb, every tear you witness, every explanation you consider is assessed for impact, for susceptibility. Theirs is not a need for reconciliation, but a hunger for dominance through the guise of shared emotion. Your internal struggle, the tug between instinct and strategy, is precisely what they seek to exploit. The more you empathize, the more you anchor yourself to their desires, and the less you control your own narrative. Their satisfaction will never arrive. It is contingent on your surrender. Here, the brutal clarity arrives. Empathy, when misapplied, is not a virtue. It is a weapon turned against the wielder. To survive, you must observe without engaging. Let their desire for closure crash against the walls of your silence. Protect your energy, guard your attention, and wield your empathy deliberately. It is a resource, not a surrender. Every moment of restraint, every choice to remain unmoved, reasserts control. Their frustration becomes proof of your autonomy. Their inability to bend you through emotional demand signals a shift in power. You realize that in the spaces left empty, in the words unspoken, the truest strength emerges. Empathy, carefully contained, can be an instrument. Empathy yielded without caution is a trap. Humans assume that speaking the truth clarifies reality. When confronted with questions, uncertainties, or conflict, there is an instinctive compulsion to justify, to explain, to illuminate motives. This pattern, however, masks a vulnerability. Words, meant to provide clarity, can be intercepted, analyzed, and repurposed. In social dynamics, explanation becomes a tool for others to map intentions, uncover weaknesses, and assert influence under the guise of civility. Every syllable carries risk, every disclosure a potential lever for control. You feel the urge to speak, to untangle the threads of your actions and lay them bare, as though transparency could shield you from scrutiny. But the moment your words leave your lips, they no longer belong solely to you. Each explanation is collected, interpreted, and stored, becoming ammunition in someone else's strategy. Their attention is surgical. They dissect the logic, the emotion, the hesitation, constructing a map of your predictability. Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, Machiavelli observed, and in your explanations, they see patterns, glimpses of your thresholds, your values, your limits. The narrative you try to control slips through your fingers, converted into a tool that pressures, manipulates, and entangles you. What you perceive as clarification is, in reality, a trap. The act of justifying is no longer an exercise in honesty. It is an invitation to be cornered, to be analyzed, to have your autonomy challenged. The weight of this realization presses like a shadow. Every sentence you construct, every rationale you offer, has consequences beyond your intent. You may believe you are protecting relationships, maintaining civility, or preventing misunderstanding. Yet each act of explanation builds a blueprint others can exploit. Their desire is not resolution. They want leverage, a key to anticipate your decisions and shape your future behavior. The clarity you provide becomes the chains they fasten to your influence. The world does not respect full disclosure. It weaponizes it. Machiavelli's words linger. The promise given was a necessity of the past. The word broken is a necessity of the present. Your words, once released, can bind you to obligations you never agreed to, giving them control without confrontation. The more transparent you are, the more predictably you can be manipulated. You start to notice the subtle ways this trap operates in your behavior. Every pause in conversation, every measured response is watched for gaps. Every hesitation is cataloged for potential exploitation. The urge to justify, to correct perception, to illuminate intent is the very mechanism that allows others to invade your strategic space. Speaking too much gives them access to the inner workings of your mind, a map that can be used to bend your actions, shape your responses, and control the narrative without a single overt demand. Silence, conversely, becomes your fortress. When you withhold explanation, ambiguity becomes your shield. The less they understand, the less they can anticipate, the less power they hold over your movements. By denying them a map of your logic, you reclaim territory they never should have occupied. Absence of words is not absence of strategy. It is the presence of dominance. Your internal world, guarded and unspoken, becomes an untouchable domain. And in that silence, the truth crystallizes. Explanation, once trusted, is often the weapon used to diminish autonomy. Speak sparingly, protect your narrative, and let the gaps you leave speak louder than any words ever could. Humans often assume that giving clarity, providing explanations, and offering closure are harmless acts of civility. There is a quiet belief that resolving uncertainty soothes tension and mends fractured connections. Yet this instinct conceals a trap. The more one over-explains, the more one exposes patterns of thought, weaknesses, and behavioral thresholds. Beneath the surface, excessive clarity transforms generosity into a debt, understanding into obligation, and compassion into vulnerability. Each act of overclosure quietly chips away at personal sovereignty. You feel the pull to fill every gap, to illuminate every dark corner of perception, to offer reassurance that is not required. Each explanation seems small, innocuous, a gesture of goodwill. But with every word, you weave threads that tether you to the expectations of others. Their appetite for understanding is insatiable, their need for resolution relentless. The more you attempt to settle the narrative, the more they extend their reach into your autonomy. It is much safer to be feared than loved. When, of the two, either must be dispensed with, Machiavelli said, and in these interactions, the lesson manifests. Overclosure cultivates reliance, which is the opposite of respect. Your concessions, given with the intent to soothe, are interpreted as availability, your explanations as permission to demand more. What begins as civility mutates into obligation, and you find yourself responding reactively to their unspoken agenda. Every act of clarity becomes a lever through which they manipulate your behavior, eroding the boundaries you assumed were secure. The subtlety of this trap is its invisibility. You convince yourself that openness, transparency, and explanation are noble. You do not see the gradual accumulation of debt, emotional, psychological, and strategic, that attaches to each word. Their satisfaction is fleeting. The hunger for control is infinite. Every story you tell, every justification you provide, temporarily quiets them, but strengthens their long-term leverage. Closure, meant to resolve, only magnifies their ability to project guilt, extract concessions, and impose interpretation. Your intentions are irrelevant. Only the effects of your disclosure matter. Silence would have preserved sovereignty, yet your desire to clarify has built a bridge into which they step uninvited. You start to notice how every gesture now has consequences beyond your intent, and the control you believed you maintained slips quietly into their hands. You begin to realize that protection is not found in explanation. It is found in measured withholding. Each boundary you enforce is a fortress, each limit a safeguard for your energy and your autonomy. Let them demand what they cannot have. Let your explanations be deliberate, your words carefully rationed, your presence strategically opaque. Machiavelli's insight resonates here. The promise given was a necessity of the past. The word broken is a necessity of the present. By resisting the urge to overclarify, you maintain the narrative's integrity. Overclosure is surrender. Restraint is power. The world does not respect the generosity of explanation. It exploits it. To master the art of strategic withholding is to reclaim the influence that overclarity would otherwise erode. Your silence becomes a weapon, your discretion a shield, and your autonomy unassailable. Every measured word reinforces your dominion. Every withheld detail preserves your freedom. And in that restraint, the truth emerges. Clarity without strategy is a liability, and the cost of overclosure is always paid with control you can never reclaim. Humans habitually equate silence with ignorance or weakness. They expect gaps to be filled, questions to be answered, narratives to be closed. In social dynamics, the compulsion to explain is constant. The absence of words is unsettling, even threatening. Yet this expectation conceals a trap. Silence, when wielded deliberately, is not emptiness, but authority. It reframes the relationship, shifting power from the seeker of answers to the holder of restraint, exposing the limits of influence while preserving autonomy. You feel the tension as questions hover in the air, unspoken yet palpable, pressing against your awareness. Every instinct urges you to fill the void, to provide clarity, to soothe the uncertainty in others. But in yielding, you surrender a subtle control that cannot be reclaimed. Their curiosity, their need for explanation, becomes your arena of dominance. It is much safer to be feared than loved. When, of the two, either must be dispensed with, Machiavelli observed, and in the silence you maintain, the lesson manifests. You do not need to justify, explain, or appease. Your restraint communicates far more than words ever could. Each unspoken answer amplifies the weight of your presence, turning absence into leverage, ambiguity into power. As they speculate, agonize, and project meaning onto the gaps you leave, their attempts at control falter. Your silence forces them into reflection, into the confrontation with uncertainty that only heightens your untouchability. The subtle art of strategic silence reshapes perception. You notice how others hesitate, how they measure their influence against the unknown. In refusing closure, you are not passive. You are sovereign. Their projections, assumptions, and unease become instruments of your authority. Every pause you maintain, every question unanswered, reinforces the boundaries they cannot cross. The quiet becomes a tool, the absence of explanation, a presence of dominance. You sense their discomfort, the friction between expectation and reality, and understand that fear of the unknown is a potent form of control. By remaining unmoved, untethered, you destabilize their assumptions, leaving them to wrestle with their own powerlessness. Your restraint is deliberate, surgical, and intentional. An unspoken message that your autonomy is not negotiable. You begin to see the larger pattern unfold. People instinctively fill silence with speculation, projecting desires, fears, and judgments onto the void you create. Each moment of restraint magnifies the psychological distance between you and those who seek influence over you. Your presence does not rely on explanation. It relies on the mastery of perception. By speaking only when necessary, you direct attention, shape understanding, and assert dominance without overt force. Machiavelli's insight lingers. Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand. Your silence is your gaze, penetrating, measured, impenetrable. The less you reveal, the less they can manipulate. The more they wonder, the more they concede power to your restraint. In this space, authority is intangible yet undeniable, commanding respect without a word, asserting control without confrontation. Silence is no longer a lack. It is your fortress, your instrument, your unyielding declaration of sovereignty. And as they wrestle with uncertainty, you remain unbound, unclaimed, untouchable, the master of your own narrative. Humans are conditioned to value presence, to equate visibility with reliability and availability with trust. There is a universal expectation that engagement signals commitment, and that absence implies neglect or weakness. Yet this assumption conceals a vulnerability. Constant presence surrenders control. When every moment is accounted for, every interaction mapped, others gain the ability to predict, manipulate, and demand more. Strategic withdrawal transforms that pattern, converting absence into leverage, curiosity into dependence, and restraint into silent authority. You feel the pull of expectation, the subtle insistence that you must explain, respond, or be available. Every instinct whispers that withdrawal is abandonment, that absence will fracture bonds or provoke disapproval. But in stepping back, in retreating from the immediate orbit of attention, you seize control. The less visible you are, the more your presence is desired, anticipated, and psychologically weighted. It is better to be feared than loved, if one cannot be both, Machiavelli observed. And in calculated absence, fear is not aggression. It is the tension of anticipation, the subtle anxiety born of uncertainty. Those who seek closure are forced into projection, compelled to measure the void you leave. Curiosity becomes compulsion, and compulsion becomes influence. By refusing to be constantly present, you dictate the terms of engagement, shaping the narrative of your return before it ever occurs. The mechanics of absence are precise. Withdrawal is not surrender. It is a deliberate act of strategy. Each step back communicates autonomy. Each delay enforces the rhythm of your choosing, their impatience, their speculation, and their attempts to fill the void reveal more about their motives than any conversation ever could. Absence is the mirror in which they confront their limitations, the space where they realize that control over you is never theirs to claim. You observe without interference as they adjust, negotiate, and anticipate your reemergence. Your return is not reactive. It is a performance, a demonstration of command. Machiavelli's lesson is clear. Men are driven more by fear than by love. And in this context, absence cultivates a subtle fear, a respect for the boundaries you impose, and an acknowledgement that your movements are intentional, not dictated. You begin to understand the rhythm of influence, how retreat magnifies presence and scarcity enhances value. Each disappearance is a lesson in control. The world bends toward the one who dictates timing. By retreating when demanded and returning only when it suits your agenda, you shift the dynamic entirely. The observer becomes the observed. The seeker of closure becomes tethered to your decisions rather than the reverse. Your absence is not emptiness. It is a vessel of power, a tool to shape perception and expectation. Mastery is not in constant engagement, but in knowing when to vanish, letting curiosity fester, and letting influence consolidate quietly behind the veil of distance. In this controlled withdrawal, you realize a dark truth. The less you are present, the more complete your dominion, and the more inevitable the obedience of those who sought to anchor themselves to you. Absence, deliberate and measured, is the silent weapon of sovereignty. Humans instinctively crave resolution. Unfinished stories, ambiguous actions, and unexplained decisions provoke discomfort and compel pursuit. They assume closure is a right, that the one who acted owes explanation. This expectation masks a vulnerability. Every demand for closure is an attempt to transfer power, to co-opt autonomy, and to shape the narrative for someone else's benefit. The pattern is universal, yet it is exploitable by those who understand the value of withholding. You feel the pressure to illuminate, to untangle every knot, to grant them the satisfaction of understanding. Every instinct whispers that compliance will ease tension, that transparency is a form of civility. But in surrendering explanation, you give away more than information. You relinquish control. Every word becomes a thread through which others can manipulate, predict, and anchor themselves to your behavior. It is much safer to be feared than loved. When, of the two, either must be dispensed with, Machiavelli observed. And in the context of closure, fear is not aggression, but strategic unavailability. By withholding, you force them to confront their own incompleteness, to wrestle with uncertainty, and to measure the limits of their influence. Your silence becomes leverage. Your restraint, a silent command. The less they possess of your story, the more you control their perception, and the more subtle power you exercise. The mastery of psychological leverage lies not in words, but in absence and ambiguity. Each omission, each calculated pause, each refusal to clarify reinforces your sovereignty. They speculate. They agonize. They fill gaps with projection. And in doing so, they reveal themselves. Their attempts to coerce clarity, to compel explanation, only highlight the extent of your autonomy. Closure, once demanded, is transformed into a weapon by the unprepared. In the hands of the disciplined, it becomes a privilege you offer selectively, on terms that serve your influence. Your energy remains unspent, your narrative intact, and your authority undisputed. In the quiet, the unseen currents bend to your intention, and the unspoken becomes the most effective instrument of command. you realize that power is perception. Control over how others interpret your actions is more decisive than any declaration you could make. You come to understand that the law of psychological leverage is absolute. Closure is not owed. It is a tool, a resource, a mechanism of dominance. To treat it as a duty is to surrender. To guard it is to rule. Your restraint is a blade, your silence a crown. Every interaction becomes a stage on which you dictate engagement, where ambiguity shapes behavior, and where the demand for resolution is met not with acquiescence, but with deliberate inaccessibility. You are untethered, unclaimed, and unbound. The mastery of emotional leverage is the mastery of self, and in this final truth, all others pale. The less you give, the more you command.